I ran into the station gasping like someone had knocked the wind out of me. And the first thing I saw was Emma sitting in the chief's office with grease under her nails and brake fluid on her hands, quiet as a stone. The principal was yelling about expulsion and criminal charges, voice sharp and loud enough to make my ears ring, while depot manager Collins had his phone out scrolling photos of severed brake lines and saying, like it was a number on a page, that repairs would cost $430,000. Harold Turner, our bus driver for 3 decades, stood near the door looking small and ashamed, like he'd been busted by his own conscience. I felt my heart slam against my ribs, and the words crashed out of me before I thought, "Why would you do this?" I still couldn't square the image of my 12-year-old who spent weekends helping me in the shop with the mess on Colin's screen. Emma didn't flinch when I asked. She turned her head slowly toward Harold and said, quiet as a judge, "I stopped him from driving 33 kids down Reedridge Pass." The room went quiet like someone had pressed pause on life. The principal tried to wave it off, said kids make wild claims when scared, but Emma kept going without looking at him. She explained how she'd watched Harold get into the bus carrying a thermos most mornings, how sometimes he smelled like alcohol, how she'd seen him stumble and swerve. She showed the chief videos on her phone, clips of Harold on the mountain route with kids on board, sometimes fingers fumbling at the wheel, other times his eyes drooping. The footage was raw and steady, not staged. You could hear children laughing in the background in one clip while Harold's hands were unsteady, and that was enough to make the whole room uneasy. When the chief asked for a breathalyzer, Harold blew a number that made even the chief look sick. He tried to laugh it off at first, tried to make a joke, but the air in his face was heavy with truth. Officers found empty bottles in his truck and photos of them later that morning. Harold snapped when the chief told him he'd be placed in holding. He lunged toward Emma like a man with no sense left. I didn't think. I shoved him back with everything I had and felt my shoulder jar. 2 officers grabbed him and held him still. I remember thinking in that moment that my hands on his chest might be the only thing between him and something worse, but I also felt something breaking inside me, betrayal, and a kind of grief for a man I'd known driving our kids for years. After the dust settled, the depot manager started making calls, canceling routes, and within an hour the town's field trip was shredded into angry parents' messages on my phone. We gave statements for hours. Emma spoke quietly but steady, showing a notebook she'd kept for 2 months where she logged dates and times she'd seen Harold drink and how she'd told the principal once before who had shrugged her off. She also pulled up an overnight weather alert about black ice and sudden freezes on Reedridge Pass. She told the chief the road had steep 36-degree grades and sharp turns where a slick patch could send a bus over the cliff. Nobody could say her motive was simple mischief when she described the route and the weather like she'd memorized both. Once I saw the notebook and the videos up close, I felt my anger switch into a different kind of resolve. Dana Whitaker, a juvenile defense attorney I called that afternoon, told me we'd need to build a necessity defense if we wanted to keep Emma out of the system. The DA, Marcus Bell, said he'd review everything, but reminded me that the law frowns on taking the law into your own hands. That line between what's legal and what's right started to feel like thin glass. The town split fast. Some families called Emma a hero, others accused her of vandalism and demanded restitution. The bus drivers' union defended Harold, saying a man couldn't be judged by a kid's accusations, but then the surveillance review turned up more footage of Harold swerving and drinking with children on board, and the narrative changed again. We handed over Emma's videos to an IT analyst who verified their timestamps and GPS data. Maintenance logs turned up missing or incomplete, and a printed email showed a principal telling an aide to delete an earlier complaint Emma had filed. When those pieces stacked, the prosecutor had to look harder. Charges for destruction of property still hovered over Emma because damage was real, but the harder truth of endangering children started to outweigh it in people's minds. By the end of the day, the chief was talking about internal reforms, and I sat there thinking about how a 12-year-old with grease under her nails had forced adults to reckon with what they'd ignored for too long. Her words hung in the air like a sentence that wouldn't let the room breathe, and then she pulled out her phone with the calmness of someone who'd rehearsed it 100 times. Emma pressed play and the videos rolled, Harold lifting a bottle from his truck, tipping it into his mouth behind the wheel, a shaky hand trying to steady the thermos lid. Another clip showed him staggering up the bus steps, chest heaving, eyes glassy while kids chattered and filed past him. In one of the worst clips, the bus jerked on a curve and a kid screamed, "Mom," as if the word could fix what was happening. I felt my insides twist each time the phone shook in her hand like the world was happening in a pocket-sized loop of proof. She didn't just play videos, she pulled up a weather advisory next. "Look," she said, holding the screen so the chief could read. The alert warned of black ice and a flash freeze overnight and spelled out Reedridge Pass by name. Emma explained the route teachers had given her, how the bus would climb then drop, how the road clung to the cliff with hairpin turns and 36-degree grades. She said if he'd driven today, the bus would have hit ice at mile marker 7 where the guardrail is gone. She said it plainly, like she'd run the numbers in her head and counted possibilities like you count nails. When she said that line about the guardrail, my vision narrowed, and I could only see past the bus windshield to a night of ice and a bus slipping. The principal scoffed at first and tried to make Emma sound like a kid trying to cause trouble, but the tone left his mouth and hit the floor when the breathalyzer came back. They handed him the device and Harold blew 3 times the legal limit at 6:45 a.m. He tried to joke, to say maybe the machine was broken, but the officers already smelled whiskey on his breath and found empty bottles in his truck. Collins took photos of the bottles with a face like someone watching a bad dream unfold into a bill. My stomach dropped to the floor and stayed there. This was the man who'd brought my kids to school every day since my eldest was in kindergarten, the man I'd waved at on cold mornings without ever thinking what might be under the lid of his thermos. When the chief read the footage and the weather advisory, he closed his eyes for a second like a man trying to hold back a storm. He ordered Harold held at the station and said we'd need statements. Harold snapped then, lunging toward Emma when the chief told him he'd be escorted out. I shoved him back hard enough to feel the jolt run through my shoulder. 2 officers stepped in and restrained him, and I remember feeling the rawness in my own hands afterward. My hands had always been tools. That day they were instruments of protection, of a slow shift from trusting to guarding. I looked at Harold's face, angry then ashamed, and saw that he'd known for a while and kept driving anyway. We spent hours giving statements while the town outside muttered through phones and car windows. Parents called me, some yelled, some cried, some wanted answers right away about refunds or new buses. A reporter called and I hung up because nothing about this felt like a story to be sold. Inside the chief's office, Emma answered questions like she was reading from the same notebook she'd used for her logs. I kept dates, she said quietly. I wrote times. I told Mr. Hargrove about it once and he told me I was wrong. Her voice didn't crack, but there was a tiredness there like someone who'd carried a secret too long. Later at home, I found that notebook and sat at the kitchen table with it open, the lines full of notes that were small and sensible and relentless. Dates, times, thermos fills, near-miss notes, descriptions of swerves and slurred slurs. I called lawyer after lawyer until Dana Whitaker took the case and told me the only way out was necessity, prove she saved lives. The DA's voice over the phone said the law doesn't allow vigilantes, even when the stakes are a school bus on a black-iced road. That sentence landed like a cold slap. I felt the town split open. Some people called Emma a hero and others called her a vandal. I felt a new kind of weight then, like standing on a bridge while people on both sides tried to pull me different ways. Emma had done the hard thing and now we had to make sure it didn't ruin her. He lunged at Emma in the middle of the office, face red, words slurred, and instinct hit me like a punch. I shoved him before I thought about consequences, felt his weight crash against the officers and watched 2 of them grab his arms and pin him to the floor like you'd hold down a wayward, dangerous animal. He cursed and spat and tried to jerk free, but the cuffs clicked and the look on his face changed from rage to something small and hollow. The chief barked orders about photographing the truck and securing evidence, and I could hear my heart in my ears while the room moved in quick, efficient motions around us. They led him out and slammed the door behind him, but the echo of that snap stayed with me in the chief's office. We sat at a long table while detectives asked questions that were the same and different all at once: times, locations, how Emma had disabled the lines, what tools she'd used, whether she'd had help. I answered the questions like a man reading from memory, hands folded to stop them from shaking. The chief stared at me with an expression that tried to balance duty and humanity and landed somewhere sour in between. He told me Harold had clearly endangered children, and he said it in a voice that made my chest loosen for a second. But he also said something that nearly knocked me back into the chair. Emma had caused massive damage, and the prosecutor would have to decide if she'd face felony destruction charges. That last part landed like a brick. I kept picturing a file stamped on her name, an entry on her record that followed her through school and college and job applications like a shadow. The idea of my 12-year-old being branded a felon for trying to keep 33 kids from a cliff felt like my ribs had been crushed. I wanted to stand up and scream that she'd saved lives, that every parent in town owed her thanks, but the reality of property damage, severed brake lines, hoses drained, buses out of commission was real, and the chief was right that the law didn't bend for good intentions. The room smelled like coffee and tired paint and the kind of cold bureaucracy that uses words like prosecutor and felony without seeing the person tied to the letter. We gave statements for hours while a deputy photographed Harold's truck and an evidence tech bagged the empty bottles that smelled of cheap anger. Emma spoke when they asked, small and steady, repeating the facts as if she'd rehearsed them in her head. I saw him drink, she said. I filmed him, I disabled lines so he couldn't take those kids. Her voice never quivered when she said it, but every so often her fingers would drum the edge of the notebook she used to track dates and times. I watched her refuse to be anything other than the person she'd chosen to be, calm, honest, and utterly resolute. There was a strength in her that broke me open, like seeing a child do something no child should ever have to do. Outside the station, the phone started to buzz with a heat I hadn't felt before. Parents called angry and scared. Some wanted refunds, some wanted to meet and ask me how I could let my daughter do something like this, and a few sobbed and thanked me between breathless, broken sentences. A reporter asked for a comment, and I hung up because I couldn't find words that weren't acid or apology. Back in the office, the chief told me the prosecutor, Marcus Bell, would review the evidence and make the call. Marcus had a reputation for being strict about property crimes, and I felt like watching a judge with a balance and no scales for context. When we left the station, the town outside felt different, quieter in some corners and angrier in others. Harold's arrest had split us into camps overnight. Some saw Emma as a hero who'd saved children, others saw a vandal who'd wrecked district equipment. I felt the pull both ways like a rope around my chest. At home that afternoon, I sat alone in the dim of the garage with Emma's notebook in my lap and reread her entries, calm shorthand noting thermos fills, stumbles, dates. The notebook was proof, and a kind of prayer, small handwriting doing the work adults refused to do. I called a dozen lawyers until Dana Whitaker took the case and told me bluntly that we'd need a necessity defense. Saving lives had to be proven as the only option she had. I thought about the legal line between wrong and right and how painfully thin it can be when a child acts from fear and love. I thought about how many adults had seen Harold and done nothing because it wasn't their job or because it was awkward or because they trusted the man who'd driven for 30 years. Watching Harold handcuffed, I felt grief for him. He'd become a danger to his own route and maybe himself, and fury at the system that let things slide. I sat with all that and tried to build a way forward that kept Emma out of prison and made sure the town owned what had happened. That night I lay awake planning like a man who'd learned to fix cars and wanted to fix this too. We had footage authenticated, a notebook, a weather advisory, missing maintenance logs, and a printed email telling an aide to delete a prior complaint. The facts were stacked like tools on my workbench. Now it was time to bring a lawyer who could use them. The law might not bow easily for a child who'd broken property to prevent a disaster, but the truth was heavier than numbers. I would fight with everything I had to make sure Emma's name didn't carry a scar for doing the right thing. That night I found Emma's notebook jammed into the side pocket of her backpack like something she'd shoved in a hurry, the zipper half caught on a pen. I opened it at the kitchen table while the house hummed around me and the entries hit me like a slow, steady drum, 2 months of dates and times, neat little lines that mapped the pattern of a danger I hadn't wanted to see. She'd written the exact mornings she'd watched Harold refill a thermos from a vodka bottle, the times she'd seen him sway on the steps, and notes about the way his hands trembled at the wheel. Each entry was small and precise, the kind of thing a kid who knows how to watch and count would write. I felt both proud of her for keeping the record and sick to my stomach that a child had kept the log adults should have kept. Her notes didn't stop at observations. She'd written down the days she'd tried to get help and how the principal had shrugged her off. One entry said, told Mr. Hargrove 312 said I was mistaken. Another said, saw thermos refill 319 vodka bottle behind truck. The page after that listed times and a quick sketch of the route with Reedridge Pass circled. It read like a ledger of worry, small handwriting that had carried a weight no 12-year-old should be forced to carry. I ran my finger along the lines and felt a kind of fury rise, a tool belt of anger at the adults who'd heard and done nothing. The more I read, the more obvious it was that she had tried the right channels and found them closed. I sat there until the kitchen light hummed and my phone battery blinked low, calling lawyer after lawyer until I finally reached Dana Whitaker. I remember feeling raw and tired and not trusting my own voice to make the case for my own child, so I listened to Dana talk in straight sentences and felt something like relief. She laid out the plan bluntly. Our best shot was a necessity defense. We'd have to prove Emma reasonably believed a disaster was imminent. She'd exhausted other means, and disabling the buses was the only way to prevent mass harm. The bar was high and the evidence had to be airtight videos with timestamps, the notebook, weather advisories, maintenance records, any witnesses. Dana said the prosecutor would be skeptical because property damage is a serious felony when it's deliberate. But if we could show imminent danger and no other option, we could keep Emma out of juvenile detention. I spent the next day like a man fixing an engine he could not afford to get wrong. I handed Dana the videos and the notebook, and she told me to hold nothing back. I printed everything I could, made copies of the weather advisory that warned of black ice and a flash freeze, and called the school asking for maintenance logs. The first responses were small and bureaucratic, but then someone in the district office sent over incomplete logs and a spreadsheet with rows missing, and my chest tightened seeing the gaps where safety should have been documented. I found a printed email in an aide's personal files where the principal told her to delete an earlier complaint. It felt like assembling a machine part by part. Each piece fit into a bigger picture that showed not just Harold's danger but a system that dropped the ball. Dana had me prepare statements and taught me how to say things simply and clearly when detectives asked. She told me how necessity defenses hinge on reasonableness and timing. A jury looks to whether a reasonable person in Emma's shoes would have believed the danger was immediate and unavoidable. We needed to show she'd tried reporting the behavior, that adults had been told and dismissed her, and that weather and route conditions made Ridge Pass uniquely deadly that morning. Dana pushed for an IT analyst to verify the video's metadata and GPS stamps, and within a day the analyst confirmed the files were authentic and unaltered. That verification felt like oxygen, proof we could point to and say, this is real. The harder parts were the politics and the whispers that followed us around town. Parents called with anger and fear and some accused us of grandstanding. The bus drivers' union rallied for Harold while others quietly thanked me, their voices small and private. I kept the notebook on the kitchen table like a plan and a promise, watching my daughter move through the house as if nothing big had happened and feeling the tiredness settle into my bones. Dana reminded me that a necessity defense doesn't erase damage but argues why harm was the lesser evil, and she said we'd have to be relentless in proving Emma's intent. She hadn't wanted to hurt property. She'd wanted to stop a catastrophe. At night, I found myself going over lines from the notebook and the videos like a mechanic tuning an engine that had to run perfectly the next day. I knew the law would not bend on sentiment, it would bend on proof. So I gathered every scrap of truth we had and put it where it could be seen: dates, timestamps, emails, and a small girl's steady handwriting that had tried to make adults listen. I would fight until I had nothing left because the alternative was letting a brave, scared 12-year-old carry a criminal mark for saving lives. The days after the arrest felt like walking through a storm with no umbrella. Everything moved fast and nothing felt settled. The drivers' union came out swinging for Harold, calling Emma's actions reckless and dangerous and painting her as a vandal instead of someone trying to stop a disaster. I got calls from parents full of heat, some furious we'd cost them a trip, others grateful we'd kept kids safe, and the town split down the middle like a cracked windshield. I heard the word traitor whispered once in the grocery aisle and felt it in the way neighbors pretended not to see me. I also heard soft, private thanks from other parents whose faces looked like they'd slept badly for years. And those quiet words kept me going when every public voice wanted to make this a simpler story than it was. Anonymous tips started trickling in the way secrets do: small, careless, and dangerous. One tip said a veteran driver had seen Harold drunk once and laughed it off. Another said there had been a group of drivers who always joked about keeping each other's backs and never reported anything. By the third tip, the pattern was obvious. At least 3 other drivers admitted to seeing Harold drink and not reporting it because of a code of silence in the depot. I remember telling Janice on the phone they protected him instead of the kids, and she didn't argue. Janice said, that silence is part of the case, it shows systemic failure. The idea that a culture of silence had formed around safety felt like a rust eating through something meant to carry weight. We handed Emma's phone to an IT analyst and waited like men waiting on a test result. When the analyst called, he sounded steady and the words he used were simple. The videos were authentic, metadata intact, GPS stamps matched the bus route. No edits, no tampering, he said, and those plain words were the kind you hope for when truth needs backing. Having that verification felt like finding the right socket for a stubborn bolt. It didn't make the whole machine run, but it gave us a solid piece to hold in our hands and point to when the union tried to cloud the facts with anger. Then Child Protective Services showed up at the house because someone, probably the union or an angry parent, reported that I left tools within reach of a child. A woman named Worker from CPS stepped into our kitchen with a folder and a look like someone who'd seen too much. She asked questions about supervision and tool storage. I walked her through our locked cabinets, our labeled bins, the workshop rules I'd taught my kids since Emma was small, and the security measures on every power tool. She checked the locks, looked at our safety protocols, and made notes. At the end she said, "You take safety seriously," and left without opening a case. I felt both relieved and angry that someone tried to weaponize the fact that Emma knew how to handle bolt cutters because she'd learned in my shop. Janice moved quickly and methodically after that. She filed discovery requests and pushed for every maintenance log, email, and safety report the district had. The first packet we got back had white spaces like missing teeth, maintenance logs that stopped mid-month, inspection sheets with holes where signatures should be, and entries that had been hand-signed by the same name over and over. It didn't take long before Janice and I found a pattern. Harold had been signing inspection sheets himself on days when the depot said a supervisor would have been present. I remember staring at those signatures like they were a map that finally showed the trail. He was signing off on his own safety checks, Janice said. That's negligence and falsification right there. Her voice made the missing pages feel like a crime scene. We started knocking on doors of drivers who were willing to talk privately. Some were afraid and huddled behind union lines, others spoke in broken sentences, admitting they'd seen Harold drink and done nothing. "You don't blow the whistle," one driver said, voice low. "You keep jobs." Another driver told me, "He's been like that a long time. We all joked. We should have told someone." Those confessions built up into a dam of regret that we could point at in court. Janice compiled witness statements and the district's incomplete records into a file that grew heavy with paper and with truth. Meanwhile, parents kept calling and the school board called an emergency meeting. The depot manager started working with investigators, and cameras from the depot and the route were pulled and reviewed. Each piece fit into the case like a wrench slipping into a socket. The missing logs, the signed inspections, the union's cover, the verified videos, the witnesses who finally spoke. It didn't make the town's anger go away, but it started to shift the blame from a single man to a system that had allowed him to keep driving. At night, I found myself running the timeline over and over, feeling the weight of the notebook on my kitchen table like evidence and like a prayer. Janice said the discovery had given us what we needed to argue necessity and systemic negligence. "Now we show it to the prosecutor," she said simply. "We make them see the choice Emma faced." The words were straightforward and hard, the kind you use when you're building something important out of broken parts. I slept poorly, hands still smelling faintly of brake fluid, but I knew we were no longer fighting in the dark. We had a file, witnesses, and the truth moving through the town like a slow, stubborn current. Then a printed email turned up like a match dropped into dry grass, and the whole situation went up in flames. The email was 5 weeks old and plain as text, the principal telling his secretary to delete Emma's complaint. I remember the paper feeling heavier when Janice slid it across the table, the words blunt and cold, an instruction to erase a child's voice. That single line did more than anger me, it changed the legal landscape. It showed that the district knew there had been a complaint and chose to bury it. Once that paper existed, the story stopped being about one kid and one driver and started being about a system that covered for itself. When the district attorneys saw that email, they stopped being polite and started asking hard questions. Marcus Bell called me back that afternoon, and his voice had the edge of a man who'd been handed proof he couldn't ignore. He said he'd want a full review and that the state might step in. The local paper, which had mostly been printing angry letters and hot takes, suddenly ran the weather advisory, the breathalyzer results, and frame grabs from Emma's videos. The front page had a sober headline and pictures that made it hard for anyone to pretend the danger hadn't been real. People who'd been arguing at kitchen tables suddenly had to reckon with a printed email and screenshots that looked like evidence from a courtroom. Once reporters got a hold of the maintenance budget records, more pieces began to clatter into place. The depot had cut random drug testing 2 years earlier to save money, a notation buried in budget minutes like an afterthought. That footnote read to me like a decision made to cut costs at the expense of safety. The insurance company smelled potential liability and opened its own investigation, which meant the district had to be careful with public statements. When I saw the budget memo that listed the testing cut, I felt anger that wasn't personal so much as practical. This wasn't just one man's failure. It was a chain of decisions that let him keep driving. The media published unedited video clips and frame grabs that left little room for argument. You could see Harold's hands wobble on the wheel, the bus drift close to the center line, and now and then a child's voice cut through the footage like a small alarm. People watched, and the town's opinion moved like a tide. Neighbors who'd been silent began to call and say things they hadn't said before: apologies, small confessions, stories of times they'd seen Harold off but said nothing. Others dug in and accused us of trying to ruin a man's life. The public split was sharper with the proof in plain view. Photos and documents gave the argument new shape. I kept thinking about that email and how it showed choice. Someone had asked an aide to delete a complaint from a child, and that act allowed a danger to ride on day after day. Janice found more documents emails between depot staff and administrators that suggested maintenance logs were not just sloppy but sometimes intentionally incomplete. A pattern emerged. Corners were cut, safety protocols eased, and when a child raised an alarm, the system shrugged. You could point to the breathalyzer and Harold's busted truck, but the email made it clear the failure was bigger than one person's drinking. It was a tendency to protect the institution first. The legal team grew serious after the email surfaced. Marcus Bell started talking to our attorney about potential charges against Harold and about how the district's negligence might change how prosecutors view Emma's actions. Suddenly, the prosecutor's office had a wider canvas to paint on. It was no longer just a property damage case. Insurance investigators began asking for maintenance records and budgets, and I watched as folders left the school's offices like traffic on a highway. The district board called emergency meetings, and the superintendent looked tired and small in live television interviews. People demanded change, and the district had to answer. Watching this all unfold felt surreal. One printed email did what shouting and pleading had not done. It forced the adults in charge to be accountable. The town shifted from gossip to evidence, and that shift made rescue real in a way yelling never had. For Emma, for me, and for parents across town, that email was the hinge. It opened a door to a process that could fix a broken system. I still held on to worry, about charges, about the mess of property damage, but with that paper in hand, I finally felt like we had a chance to explain why a 12-year-old did what she did. The facts were no longer up for debate. They sat in black and white and demanded action. Marcus Bell called back like a man who turned a file over and found the hard truth under the paper, and he offered a deal that felt like the only bridge out of the mess. "We can do a diversion," he said plainly, and I listened like the world had narrowed to that one sentence. The offer was 100 hours of community service teaching safety, plus restitution of $10,500, all to be completed in 6 months with no criminal record if she finished. I thought of Emma sitting at our kitchen table with grease under her nails and that notebook open. I thought of a school bus on black ice and 33 kids. I sat with the number in my head and finally said, "We'll take it." We accepted because it was the least destructive path for a child who'd done something terrifying but right. The diversion felt like a hand on my shoulder, an attempt to repair without making a criminal out of a child. Dana Whittaker told me the arrangement was smart. It kept Emma out of juvenile lockups and let her turn what happened into teaching, not shame. "Make it public service and learning," Dana said. "Let her lead safety workshops. Make restitution real but not crushing." So Emma agreed to teach safety workshops, to stand in front of groups of kids and parents and show them what she'd done and why. She would do 100 hours, the district would track it, and if she completed everything, her record would remain clean. The idea of her telling other kids how to spot danger felt right. She could turn fear into knowledge. Harold's case moved on a different track and the law hit it hard. He pleaded guilty to multiple counts of child endangerment after the breathalyzer, the videos, and the growing evidence of a cover-up in the district. Standing in court, he looked smaller than I remember, the color gone from his face like someone who'd been driving in fog too long. He lost his commercial driver's license and was ordered into mandatory rehabilitation with lifetime bans on working with minors. "I'm sorry," he wrote later in a letter from rehab, and the words carried a kind of broken truth. Losing his job was necessary. Letting him near kids again would have been a risk none of us could accept. The sentence felt like justice mixed with sorrow, justice for the kids and sorrow for a man who'd let himself fall that far. The principal's role in the cover-up couldn't be ignored either. Once the printed email and other documents had surfaced, the board put him on suspension while they investigated. It became clear he'd asked for complaints to be deleted and that maintenance logs had gaps where safety should have been documented. Under pressure, he resigned. Watching him walk away from his desk felt like watching a paper boat finally sink under the weight of truth. People muttered in the grocery store and in church parking lots. Some felt vindicated, others disgusted. The town had to face the fact that adults had failed to protect the very children they were paid to keep safe. The district didn't stop at changing faces, it changed systems. They installed breathalyzer locks on buses so a vehicle couldn't start without a clean test. They put body cameras on drivers and GPS trackers on all routes so administrators could see patterns in real time. They adopted an anonymous reporting app so a kid, or a driver, could tip off concerns without fear of being branded a troublemaker. I remember the depot manager telling Janice on a conference call that the budget would be adjusted to fund testing and cameras, and he sounded like a man who'd learned to be careful with words. These changes mattered because they meant the problem wasn't just blamed on one person anymore. The system had been retooled. The insurance company's investigation pushed the district along too, because potential liability can make slow institutions move fast. They tightened procedures, updated their training, and publicly acknowledged failures. A public meeting was held where parents asked hard questions and the superintendent promised transparency and new checks. Some parents still didn't forgive Emma, others brought casseroles and notes that said things like, "Thank you for saving our kids." Those small acts meant as much as any policy change to me. Emma completed the community service and taught dozens of workshops. I watched her stand in front of groups, hands steady, explaining what to look for and how to report danger. People clapped at the end, some with tears. When restitution payments were arranged, the district accepted a fair number and set up a plan that wouldn't ruin a child. Marcus Bell closed Emma's file with a note that the diversion had finished successfully and no record would follow her. I felt a heavy part of me lift, like a car jack releasing pressure. In the end, change came slow and messy, but it came. Harold went to rehab and wrote apology letters. The principal was gone. The district had new safeguards. Emma lost some innocence, but she gained a voice and the respect of many who had once doubted her. I kept the notebook in a drawer, pages worn at the edges, and every so often I reread a line and remember how close we all were to losing so much. We rebuilt the shop, went back to normal in the ways that matter, and kept meeting each week to talk. I still think about that morning and the choice my daughter made. I still feel the metal taste of fear that day. But we got a different ending than the one the road could have handed us, and for that I am grateful and forever wary. The town started to breathe easier before I did, and I remember the first morning when the air felt different, lighter, like someone had opened a window after a storm. Emma finished her community service early, clocking more than the required hours because she wanted to make sure kids knew how to spot danger and how to document it, down to dates and times and the kind of details that had saved lives. She stood in school cafeterias and community centers teaching kids how to write things down, who to tell, and how to use the anonymous app so they wouldn't be afraid to speak up. Watching her teach felt strange and proud at once, like seeing your own hands doing something you never planned for. People noticed changes beyond our family. Neighboring counties started adopting the anonymous reporting app after seeing how useful it had been here, and that made me feel like our trouble had a purpose larger than our small town. "It's about giving kids a voice," Emma told a group of parents once, plain as a handoff in my shop. Her workshops drew students and teachers who wanted to learn how to document concerns without fear. The district published guides and ran training sessions. And for the first time in a long time, the word safety felt real and active instead of a poster on a wall that no one followed. Some families drifted back into the way they'd been before, offering small, awkward apologies in grocery aisles or catching me at church to say, "We're sorry, we should have listened." Others stayed cold and distant like a window that won't clear. I didn't force anything. Apologies can't be ordered, and forgiveness takes a different shape for everyone. For the families who apologized, we shared stories and coffee and sometimes tears, and those conversations helped stitch us back together. For those who stayed away, I felt the loss but also a certain clarity about who we were as a family and what we'd chosen to do. Harold wrote to us from rehab once, and I read his letter slowly at the kitchen table like a man reading an old instruction manual line by line. "I'm sorry," he wrote, and then he said he'd been sober for 192 days and was trying to rebuild a life without working around kids. The words were small and honest, and they didn't fix everything, but they were something. I thought about the man who had driven our kids for 30 years and how sorrowful and human his apology sounded when stripped of excuses. I wrote back, kept it short, and told him to focus on getting well. There's no joy in watching someone lose a job, but there was relief that he might not be a danger again. We rebuilt routines that had frayed under the strain. We started weekly family check-ins in our living room with the lights low and the shop radio off, a simple habit where we shared what scared us and what we were grateful for that week. Emma talked about school and a new friend who'd come to her workshop, and I talked about reopening the shop and ordering parts. Those meetings were small safety valves that kept us honest and aligned. I opened the shop again one Saturday morning and felt the familiar weight of tools under my hands, and that normalcy was a balm after months of hearings and headlines. The district didn't just change who was in the office, it changed how things were done. Breathalyzer locks went on buses, driver body cameras were installed, GPS trackers ran routes in real time, and the anonymous app let someone tip concerns without fear. The depot rehired new drivers after stricter checks and retraining, and the maintenance logs were kept like a legal duty. I watched the depot manager talk about safety on a live town broadcast and mean it. Those changes mattered because they made it harder for a dangerous person to slip through the cracks again. There were harder bits I carried alone, Like the nights I pictured the bus slipping on black ice. But the reforms eased the sting because they were practical and durable. Emma got recognized at a county ceremony for her community workshops and stood on stage with me in the front row, hands folded, face steady. People clapped and some cried. I thought about how a 12-year-old had forced adults to look, to change, and to fix a system that nearly killed children for the sake of convenience and silence. The scandal changed everything, yes, but it also forced changes that made our kids safer. In the end, Emma's courage didn't erase the damage or the anger, but it did build something new from the wreckage. Safer buses, clearer reporting, and a community that slowly learned to put children first. I keep her notebook in a drawer now, the pages worn at the edges, and sometimes I read a line and remember the metal taste in my mouth the morning I walked into that station. We rebuilt the shop, rebuilt trust where we could, and lived on guarded, grateful, and forever changed.